So is in fact this car price bubble about to burst? Yes, it actually is. But wait! It's very, very important that you listen to what I'm about to tell you. I'm going to share with you some of the market trends, some of the opinions by key experts, and then we're going to share with you when the best time to actually buy your next car. Let's get into it now.
Life's too short to drive boring cars.
So before we really get into when the best time to actually buy your next car because of the bursting bubble is, I have to start explaining some of the key market elements that are going on right now. Firstly, we have to talk about the obvious, the elephant in the room, and we're talking about inflation. Inflation's been rising and it's actually at a 40-year high right now. It's at a point where it's almost out of control. And now as a result, what's actually being done are the federal governments, whether it's on the US, Canada, and really across the board, they're adding on increases to the bank rates. So what that means is they're lifting the roof. The banks now are applying increases, 3/4 points, 1 point increments to actually help curtail the purchasing, because it's ultimately all this expenditures, all these purchases. Buyers are getting excited. They're getting out there because of typically low interest rates, that it seemed very palatable to go out and buy their next new car. Rates were very low. It's almost giving the car away at the cost. But clearly, it's this runaway condition that's caused the need for the government to step in and start hitting the consumers on large purchases with an increase. So that definitely will impact housing market, it'll impact the car market, and of course, that's typically going to start slowing the market down. Then some people say, well, the chip shortage is a factor, and of course that's been the key buzzword for the longest time, but guess what? It's not quite as bad, and apparently a lot of vehicles are starting to come back in the loop. And drive by a Dodge dealer these days and you'll probably find that the car lot is full of vehicles. I might also add that I had to rent some cars this week. I had a vehicle that was out of service, and I had a selection of about 6 or 7 different vehicles at the rental company, which clearly indicates that they're starting to get back up. Inventory typically in the rental companies were very, very low during the pandemic, and that caused a lot of struggles. These are all signs. Now there's availability on the rental market. We're seeing some car lots are filling their lots slowly, piece by piece. Sure, some you have to wait. And there are one-offs. For example, Toyota Tundra with the hybrid, you actually have to wait 2 to 3 years to get your vehicle. But yet if you go with the non-hybrid version, for example, on some of those vehicles, you can get it within 3 or 4 months. So it depends how selective you are. Now, there's been a lot of market analysts that are piping in and saying, yeah, the bubble's bursting and it's just going to go off the edge. And quite frankly, that may or may not be true. But the reality is, a lot of people have been buying and borrowing money for their brand new shiny car. And a lot of people were possibly overextending themselves during that event. Because why? Because the government and the stimulus packages were throwing money out like it was going out of style. So people were taking them up on that. Now, unfortunately as well, some of the lenders weren't criticizing the borrowers all that much. In other words, they were just signed on the dotted line and the car's yours. So there hasn't been a lot of challenges in getting a car during this whole last 2 to 3 years. And so you ask yourself, well, what kind of impact is that having? Well, that has a direct impact, because as well, I have to throw another piece of this equation is called repossessions. And repossessions have been off the charts. They're climbing at an alarming rate. And not just on typically what they consider subpar buyers or borrowers, where people that are typically higher risk, that a lot of them are starting to default. No. Experts are actually indicating that even prime borrowers, typically people that have a great track record and are lower risk lender and are lower risk borrowers, are now also starting to default. Why? Because inflation's climbing, and of course lending rates are going up. You know, the obvious signs, you get locked into a rate. Sure, some people say, well, what does that have to do with it if I already bought the car and I'm borrowing against my car and it's 3 to 5 year loan or maybe a 7-year loan? Well, the reality is a lot of those prime buyers also own homes, and a lot of those homes now are subject to refinancing, and of course you have to reassess, and the banks have to renew your mortgage. Well, the problem is there now all of a sudden the interest rates on your homes are skyrocketing because of what the governments are doing, and the banks, both of the US side, Canadian side of the border, are cranking up the rates. So people are stuck and they're saying, hey, I clearly need a roof over my head, I need food in the mouth. Maybe the car gets defaulted. That's the one thing that we don't really need. So that's starting to happen, and we're starting to see repossessions across the board going up at an alarming rates. Let's also not forget that, looking in history here in the last little bit, there's lots of people that I've talked to. For example, I'm looking online here, and some folks have identified, for example, a 2022 WRX was listed at $45,000. It's actually the kind of dollar that you'd expect to pay for an STI. So the dealers are getting a little overzealous. They're starting to gouge. As well as a Tesla Model 3 is another prime example where I'm seeing another customer having to pay upwards 80 grand for the performance edition of the Tesla Model 3, where typically that was further down in that $50,000, $60,000 range. The dealers are now ripping people off. So now there's a reluctance to buy cars. The dealers are jacking it up. Interest rates are climbing. Inflation's still climbing, albeit a slightly reduced rate. And there's an overall reluctance for people to buy the cars. And while organizations like Canadian Black Book now still predict that we don't expect to get out of this boom for another 4 years, clearly other market trends seem to counter that very thought. Some of their thoughts happen to be around the premise that, the consumers are getting smarter. We're having to work harder for our dollars, and it's not as easy as it was, say, a year ago or even 2 years ago. Now people are starting to shop around. And as they're shopping around, they're able to negotiate from one dealer to the next and have them kind of bid across from each other. And that tends to start to drive prices down. Dealers are going to have to get more competitive. Then you have also other manufacturers, for example, like Ford, are starting the conversation about selling directly to the consumer and bypass the dealer network altogether. There's lots of market forces here that are forcing the dealers and the manufacturers to get more competitive, and the consumers are just getting a little smarter and thriftier, especially now considering that when they extend themselves and to make that next car purchase, they know that the interest rate's going to be higher, and they're going to have to be much thriftier, more creative, and even possibly more skeptical, and consider deferring that purchase until they actually need a car. This is definitely going to help drive prices down. We also can't forget that some of the governments are also starting to kick in other localized provisions. Of course, for example, the Canadian government. Have you heard that they're introducing that new luxury tax? And that's going to apply to anything over $100,000. Now, while this doesn't impact the majority of the population, just look around. You've got a diesel dually pickup truck that is now over $100,000. Or somebody wants to buy a new BMW 5 Series, or say, for example, an M3 or a new upscale Audi, or really anything more upscale, you're going to start paying an additional 10% just to try to recoup some of the dollars that they overspent and threw away during this whole last 2 years. Now, we know Canada is not alone, and every government is looking at these types of opportunities to recoup some of the money that they've spent on some of these stimulus packages in the last little bit. Now, if you look at a very fundamental level, it always boils down to supply and demand. And of course, as all of this supply starts to build, the demand reduces because, again, as I said, interest rates are climbing. People have a smaller margin to play with because of the rest of cost of living is still continually to increase. Stimulus packages are disappearing. And so with a reasonable amount of time, you'll start to find at the wholesale level, the used cars, pricing will start to slowly drop. Then, of course, that translates over to the retail market. Now, while there's some analysts and there's also many YouTubers that talk about this very topic, and looking at a 0.7% drop on 1 month and a 1% drop on the next month isn't the biggest indicator, but 2-3 months consecutive drops is certainly a telltale that something's brewing. And the reality is this bubble in fact bursting, and in short, yes, it is, right in front of our very eyes. And I made a video short time ago that the prices are dropping like a rock. And there was a few people that wondered and said, hey, I don't see prices at my local dealership any cheaper. And that's right, that's the reality, because it's a lagging effect. And what we're seeing is on the wholesale market, as I say, we're starting to see the trends of it dropping off. As interest rates start to continually climb, more people are underwater, there's more repossessions, there's going to be more supply, and of course demand will drop. That's going to change pricing. We know that that's going to happen, but it's not going to happen immediately. The best course of action is continually watch and wait this out. Continually maintain your old beater. Keep it running for a little while and save up your pennies. Because once you wait, what you're going to find is every month on month as this continues on, we're going to find prices slowly notching down. Now, we're not going to find this thing going boom and all of a sudden the prices are going to drop by 40%. I don't see that happening anytime soon. I do, in fact, though, see that constant decline to the point where if you have money in your hands, cash is king now. There was a time when absolutely cash was not king. This will be the time. You want to have that buying power, but you don't want to have to buy from the bank because the bank will be exercising those high interest rates, as I already mentioned. Don't be overextending yourself with a floating line of credit. Don't borrow on a 7-year loan. for $800 a month payments. If you have to borrow money, make sure it's a very short term and it's well within your budget. But now we're currently at a place where week on week, month on month, we're going to see this gradual decline and dealers are going to become more motivated, just like my local Jaguar dealer who keeps reaching out to me to buy the latest F-Type that they have in the showroom and they just can't sell it. So there are pockets of opportunities. And as time goes on, now with this luxury tax, they're even more desperate. I'm having dealers reach out and saying, get it while it's hot, because September 1st is when they switch over the clock here in Canada for this new luxury tax. But just remember this, MSRP has been cranked up by many manufacturers. Don't be caught up in the fact that a car that was upped by 40%, now them knocking off 15%, telling you that it's a great deal is not a great deal. Let's get this back down to reality, back to a base level, understand where the MSRP was of these vehicles, and it's gotta make sense. But again, as I say, cash is king and the bubble has burst. And with all of that said, be sure to click right there. You're going to love that video. It's all about the things not to tell that used car salesmen so you don't get ripped off. Hope to see each and every one of you. Please be sure as well to hit that subscribe button and we'll see you on the next one. Catch you real soon. Bye-bye.